still sleeps till 9 or 9:30.
God, I haven't slept in that late and I don't even know how
Arnie
long.
Arnie leaves is gone by 6, so like have the whole morning to myself.
That's nice. Yeah, dad sleeps in. Mom was the one that gets up with the baby. But I told him that like when he's 4 and like has a tummy ache that he can go to dad's side of the bed. I did my work. I did my part.
That's the transition time, 4 years old. That's,
They'll never come on, let's be honest. I when I
yeah.
think of the number of times that I went to my dad's side of the bed for anything, I think I can count that on maybe one hand. I always went to mom's side. It was closer to the door. Whenever I had a nightmare.
Yeah, that's how it is in our house too. They
Yeah.
sometimes come over. I sometimes get a snuggle, which I
But usually
appreciate.
it's mommy.
Yeah.
Sharon always went to dad. The girls go to Sharon now, but I mean, for the most part, but they're older too. So,
Yeah.
but now we get phone calls.
Oh,
Oh,
I lost her. I think we should get started.
Okay.
okay. Hello, it's so nice to see all of you. I don't get to do a lot of these lunchtime talks just due to my schedule. So it's nice that I was able to jump in and do one of these talks with Rabbi Joel. So it was advertised talking about the idolatry within social media, but we really just wanted to talk about social media in general. What would Judaism, what would our rabbis have to say about social media and our usage? Obviously, there's no way for the rabbis, the Talmud, to have predicted that we would be doing a class together on Zoom in the middle of a pandemic, and that our main form of communication and learning and socialization in the year 2020 has been online. But I think there's enough that the rabbis did comment about that we can make some pretty safe assumptions about what they would say about the positives of social media and also the dangers that we should all kind of be aware of as we're navigating kind of this new world that we're in. So I just wanted to kind of go through some of the different social media platforms, kind of to see maybe which one of them you're on. I know out of this list I'm about to read, I think I have an account for every single one of them. I am a true millennial in that spirit. But we have Facebook, we have YouTube, we have Instagram. For Generation Z, which I just discovered, we have TikTok, we have Snapchat, and we have good old Twitter, and there's many, many more. But I'm sure some of you are on those. I'm sure that your kids are on them, your grandkids could be on them. So I wanted to start with some basic kind of stats about social media pre and post pandemic. So we can all agree social media has completely changed the way that we live our lives. It's changed the way that we get our news, the way that we interact with our loved ones, especially during this pandemic. And since 2004, I was actually just saying before we all came on that I remember being, I think I was the first college class of Facebook users when you had to have a .edu address and you had to be enrolled in a college in order to be on Facebook. I remember signing up for like the beta testing of it when it was only through a couple of universities at the time. But since that moment of Facebook, social media has grown exponentially. And I really don't think it's reached its top of popularity yet. And there's no denying that social media platforms, especially now in a time that we're all stuck in our homes, social distancing, has become a way that we communicate with the outside world. So to give a little bit of background, a 2019 Pew Research study showed that 3.5 billion social media users worldwide, and this is a number that has only grown since the pandemic. Facebook is the #1 social media platform since its launch, and it's continually evolving to meet its users' needs of all generations. With over 2.32 billion active monthly users, Facebook remains the most widely used social media platform. Roughly 2/3 of US adults, 68%, and this was back in 2019, now report that they are Facebook users. So to break it down even further, 90.4% of millennials, 77.5% of Generation X, and 48.2% of baby boomers are active social media users. In that Pew Research poll, they averaged that 3 hours a day are spent by a person on social network and messaging each day. Since the lockdown in March 2020, worldwide, more than half of the world now uses social media, 4.57 billion people. From the lockdown, there were 346 million new users that have come online within the last 8 to 9 months. So social media is everywhere. It is completely unavoidable at this point. It's powerful and it's here to stay. But as we all know from wonderful movies, with great power comes great responsibility. And that's what we're going to talk about from the Jewish perspective, what our responsibilities are in terms of social media. So first, I'm going to open up to you guys some of the positives of social media, because there are many, and I'm sure many of you are experiencing them right now. Go ahead, Jeff. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And honestly, at this point, my assessment of these social medias is much more dangerous and much more difficult to really condone in all age groups. I've seen 2 young high school teenagers die in suicide due to the harmful effects of rumor mongering.
Yeah.
Since rumors and Lashon Hara used to be a one-to-one affair, today the gang effect of using social media to spread these negative terms about anyone is so destructive that we're afraid to even look at that as a consequence of social media.
Good. And we're going to get to some of that, Jeff. But before we get to that, let's start with the positives before we go down the dark hole of the negatives.
Because there are many negatives, but there's also many positives. Sukasa, did you have one? Okay, so we can all agree our worldview has been expanded. 50 years ago, it was much harder to know what was going on in the rest of the world. And now we can sign on to social media. We can see videos of what's happening. We know about civil conflicts when they happen. Everyone has a cell phone and can upload, videos. You no longer have to depend on the news because someone is there with their cell phone at the source. So it's expanded our worldview. We are right now connected to people all over the world. The fact that with our services on Facebook that we're able to have people watching from different countries is something that would not have been possible without social media. We're connected to friends and family during this pandemic. The number of people who are still able to maintain those family relationships, maybe even reach out to new relationships. So many people reach out to people that they went to high school with, or college, people that they would have lost sight of for the rest of their life, are able to reconnect through the magic of social media. And the other thing with the internet is we can pretty much look up anything that we want to and find an answer. That's the key, an answer. So someone said here, we are able to tune into 2 different Shabbat services in the same night. Yes, you can do a Shabbat tour of every single service across the country if you wanted to, because they're on Facebook and YouTube.
Cantor Lisa and I, in the early days of the pandemic, remember, we would text each other on Friday afternoons because we would start at 3 p.m. our time. We'd start with the East Coast feeds, and we'd make our way across the country as we were looking at what other people were doing around the country to get a sense of what was out there. I have to admit, I don't do that anymore. But
I don't either. I kind of got
the early days. But a pretty phenomenal experience for the Jewish community, if we want to even narrow it down to the Jewish experience, as Melanie pointed out. On a Friday night, we can be exposed to such a diversity of Jewish perspectives, and throughout the week, of course, the learning opportunities that are happening around the world. We never would have had that kind of exposure and that depth of learning and community building if it wasn't for social media.
100%. So we can all agree that there are a lot of positives, but as Jeff brought up, there are a lot of negatives that we need to be aware of as we're navigating this new terrain. It's not so new, but it is new. It's a whole new way of socializing. The first one we're going to talk about, and this is not to be partisan, this has nothing to do with politics, this is just a fact of the matter, that we are living in an age of fake news. If you can read it online, it can appear as if it's a newsworthy source. If you can click on it and share it with others, it's a dissemination of misinformation that can be extremely dangerous. So we live in a world of truthiness, as a television personality Stephen Colbert once described. which is based on assertions based on intuition and belief rather than facts, logic, or evidence. Every day on social media, we are inundated with fake news, and we are inundated with accusations of fake news, which often seem aimed not at what is actually false, but rather at opinions that differ from our own. And so our struggle as people who are on social media, as people who are taking in this inundation of information, our struggle is to figure out what is true and what is false within these digital technologies. And that is becoming increasingly more difficult to separate fact from fiction. So what is truth in a digital age in which we have to question everything that we read, hear, and say? And I think that Jewish tradition teaches us very early on that we must discover truth for ourselves. Judaism teaches that it is our sacred obligation to study, to question, and to debate, that we can't blindly accept truth, what politicians or pundits, or even, as in the story that I'm about to tell, or even what God tells us, that we're meant to struggle and wrestle in order to discover truth. If you all remember the story of Jacob and Esau in the Torah, when Jacob is about to have a reconciliation with his brother and has no idea what's going to happen, he's visited by an angel, a spirit, or he's wrestling with his own demons, however it is that you want to imagine it. But he is renamed Israel, which means to struggle. That as Jews, we are a people who are supposed to struggle with information given to us. Nothing is supposed to be taken point blank. We are supposed to constantly question. That's what the rabbis, the Talmud, were doing. They would read something in the Torah, something wouldn't make sense to them, and they would question, and they would discover, and they would try to find the truth that sat deep within them. You know, when we say a blessing over studying Torah, the blessing isn't, thank you for letting us read Torah so that we can take everything that it is at face value. It's la'asok bedivrei Torah, to allow us to engage, which means to ask those questions and to really think about what it is that we're reading. That's what we're giving the blessing to when we read Torah. So this is a lesson, story from the Talmud that's about the oven of Achnai. And in the story, the rabbis are debating whether a certain type of oven can be made ritually impure based upon what it's made of. Rabbi Eliezer argues that it's pure, while all of the other rabbis, who are led by Rabban Gamliel, argue that it's not pure. When Rabbi Eliezer cannot convince them, he calls upon a nearby carob tree to move or do something to show that he is indeed correct. The carob tree immediately shuffles from one place to another, but the other rabbis look at each other and say, that proves nothing. Rabbi Eliezer then calls on a nearby stream to prove that he is correct, and the stream immediately flows backwards, but the other rabbis still will not give in. Rabbi Eliezer commands the walls of the study house that they're in to lean inward, which of course they immediately do, but still the rabbis refuse to agree. So at this point, Rabbi Eliezer is getting kind of angry because nothing's working. His stature, his reasoning, not even these miracles of having these inanimate objects move, it's not getting him anywhere. So he invokes the highest authority that he can think of. He says, quote, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. There's silence, and then straight from heaven, there's a bat kol, interpreted as the voice of God. Why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? The law is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion. He is correct. Rabbi Yehoshua, who's on Rabban Gamliel's side, says, how dare God interfere in the debate? He responds, lo bashamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven. His point being, the Torah is a sacred text, but God gave us Torah at Mount Sinai, along with the power and the authority to interpret it for ourselves. God is no longer revealed in miracles and voices, but in human reasoning and interpretation, and in that human debate and the hard work of reaching a consensus. So although Rabbi Eliezer's interpretation aligned with God's self, the people are still allowed to overrule God and make their own decisions about what they think is true. Now, in the story, which comes a little bit later, we wonder what God must have said when faced with the charge that lo bashamayim he, the Torah is not in heaven, and that God has to recuse God's self from this important decision about the oven of Achnai. And it's actually the prophet Elijah who answers this question. He tells Rabbi Natan that upon hearing Rabbi Yehoshua, God smiles and says, yes, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. And I think this is what sums up and has become accepted in Jewish law, that no matter who tells us what it is, that we have a responsibility to find the truth for ourselves. So that's how I related this story of the Talmud to the age of fake news. Go ahead, Sukasa. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go.
What I find with social media is that people only look to sources which reinforce their previously held opinion. So there's nothing else for them to look at. And they don't, everybody, we all like to be right. So if you can find sources over and over that make you right, and you surround yourself with friends that think you're right, I think that's one of the main sources of some of the differences we're seeing in where people are so they're in their own camps and they don't want to hear from the other side. They're not open to it because they've had such an amount of information that supports their view.
It's the echo chamber effect.
Yeah, and they're built into the systems themselves, especially
Yes.
Facebook, right?
Exactly.
Or the algorithms that just help with perpetuate those echo chambers, as Cantor Lisa was saying, right? So it's even more of a challenge these days to have to burst out of the bubble, because you can't just scroll through a social media feed to get a different perspective. You almost have to create, I don't know, an alternate ego and set up another account so you could be, I don't know. I mean, you really have to go outside the social media and start looking, and it takes work, right? It's not like we can now sit back and just take in the information. It's more incumbent upon us to have to be not passive, but active in trying to find truth.
Totally. Go ahead, Jack.
The same definition has applied to educational processes throughout recent history specifically. They talk about a depth of knowledge versus a breadth of knowledge. And the internet and sources of information, from sound bites on TV to the internet, gives you a broad swath of information, but it has no depth. There's no ability for the vast majority of people to ask that question: what are the sources? What is the reality of this statement and the verification of this statement? Where does it lie? So that it enhances breadth of exposure, but it sacrifices that as to depth of understanding and verification of any of these sound bites. And that's the weakness. But people are so tuned to that type of delivery of information today. The scholarly approach, the depth of search is absent for the most part. Not everywhere, not everyone, but as a broad population view, I think that there's such a shallowness of reason and the ability to search out information on your own that is frightening.
Yeah, it's scary. I was listening to the New York Times podcast last week, I think, one of the daily episodes, and it was all about journalism and how now there are companies, and it was talking about one company in particular, who this guy, because journalists are rarer these days, and newspapers are folding, and getting local journalists is more difficult, that he has a company basically that sets up basically fake websites that look like newspapers, local newspapers, and hires people who are not journalists to serve as journalists and to create articles that are bent towards one political side or the other, and to put them on a website that, if you were to go to this website, it would look like a local newspaper, but in fact it's not, at all. It's a company who's getting paid by someone to write an article in there to support their perspective, and it's going up. So it's getting harder and harder. You can't even go to a website and assume now that that website is legitimate. I mean, how complicated it's getting for us to really dig to the truth and to find it. It is scary.
Look at Yelp. Look at all the fake reviews of restaurants as an example. I mean, it's pervasive. How do you profit from it?
Yeah, it's made our jobs so much harder. We're flooded with information constantly. I mean, I remember as a kid, you know, it was very easy. You went to the grocery store and you passed by the National Enquirer or all of these like fake little, you know, newspapers, and you knew like, oh, that's just, you know, they're just trying to get a rise out of people. And you could depend on, you know, just the regular paper news that was delivered on your driveway every morning that had facts. And now it's anyone can make facts. Anyone can edit a Wikipedia page. Anyone can, you know, create a website that looks like a respectable news organization. And so it's our job to literally question everything. And it makes our jobs so much more difficult as people who have to take in this information, research it, find out those credible sources, because it can be extremely, extremely dangerous.
Lori, did you want to say something?
Anybody remember the fairness doctrine? That until the 1990s, at least network news had to be fair and balanced. And that stopped, particularly at that time. I think that was probably when Fox News started up. And so you now have two camps. And if you try to follow the same story, and sometimes I really do try to follow the same story from two different perspectives in two different cable news, it's like one story is completely ignored, and on the other side it'll be the headline. It's just totally out of control, and it's so different that what happens to people like me is it's like I can't watch that. I have to turn it off when I'm watching the opposite opinion. So it's just dividing this whole country in a way that I don't know how we're ever going to be able to, you know, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So
yeah, it's going to be tough. By the way, I just put the link to that podcast that I was referring to if you want to go and listen to it at some point. I put that in the chat, so feel free to go check that out. Talia, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just moving around so I don't have the video on, but hasn't it always been this way in a sense? Because it's always been who's running the narrative. So if it's, you know, white people, then of course it's going to be imbalanced even, you know, 100 years ago. And I kind of feel like this is like a breaking point for us to have to be responsible for our own consciousness, because if we leave it up to the news people of yesteryear, I mean, I remember Dan Rather, people like that. It was like great, but at the same time, it wasn't balanced even then. I mean, Jews haven't really been able to be Jewish in the media. Like, look at all the entertainers that had to change their last name in order to be accepted, like Winona Ryder, Winona Horowitz, all the Douglases. And it's like maybe now we'll be able to break open a little more. It's going to be a harder struggle, but we all have to be a little bit more, I don't know if the word's conscious or conscientious or both, but not just let other people spoon feed us, because otherwise we're just kind of sheep. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah.
Takes a lot of time though.
Right. It does take
the
a lot
other
of time.
side of this issue electronically is, what is the real thrust of these websites in the sense of Facebook and this personal communication and other people? Is it that we feel less, or do we want to be made to feel more by reading the stories of other people? It's not fascination. It has to be some type of vast confirmation that we need about our own value in reference to other people in this social media arena. I mean, why do you want to know that somebody else took a trip 5 days ago and spent I mean, the details are inane to begin with. And yet, what does it do to you? What type of psychological deficits does it fill?
Yeah,
I feel
we're
like
gonna
that's
get
a
into that.
perfect segue.
Yeah, but
That was a
Merle, I know
perfect
Merle
segue.
wanted to say something before we segue into
Sure.
to that.
I'm just going to say you live in a place like Phoenix, Arizona, where it's incredibly over conservative. And like this morning, I read stuff in the newspaper that if I were to, and I'm screaming at the newspaper or the TV because it's like, you don't know where to go with it. And Arnie's like, you know, stop yelling about it. But then I look at like the editor of the day makes one comment, and then on 3 different channels on TV, they're saying totally different. So, you know, and this was about a construction issue. This wasn't even a political issue. So you really don't know what to believe anymore unless you find a way to research it and and qualify it in some way. The other thing as to what Jeff just said, you know, when Facebook first started, it was an avenue for friends and family to communicate and to see one another, where we're all over the country or the world for that matter. And slowly but surely over the years, all of these things like Twitter and all these things have incorporated news or news channels, and you can become friends with anybody if you and friends and people can. I mean, I get requests for friends, and I'm like, how the hell did they find me? I mean, what do they want from me? No, I don't want any part of you. And then now I'm finding the same thing on Instagram, where it started, where it was just so I could communicate with my family and my cousins, and my granddaughter could share her dance stuff. But now it's I'm finding myself, and now it's become a complaint base, where I'm watching friends who are frustrated with everything that's going on, and I totally understand their frustration. But rather than try and make good with what they have, they're using it as a place to just complain about everything. And I find myself that unless I really trust the person, I just scroll right through it and don't even read comments anymore.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's now we wanted to move into this fact of social media, that it's not just about how we perceive the outside world, but it really is starting to affect how we perceive ourselves, right? And that really comes back to this idea of the selfie culture, right? And that much of social media, there is the piece of it where we could see from the fake news perspective how we are starting to be shaped by social media in terms of how we see the world around us. But also one of the big challenges, and if we look at the 10 Commandments and this idea of you shall not have idols, right? And that one of the most fascinating and challenging pieces has been this move to the self, putting the self purely at the center, right? Every single camera that we have out there these days has a way. Remember the good old days where cameras, you would look through the viewfinder and you would take a picture of what's out there, right? And now every single camera has built into it the ability to switch the view purely to the self, right? The selfie, right? There are 53 million selfies that are tagged selfie on Instagram, and there's probably a million more, right? Thinking about all the ways in which people now don't even need. There was something about when you would go somewhere where you would have to ask someone to take a picture for you, right? You'd either hand the camera, right? And I think at the core there's something very powerful about asking a stranger to participate in creating a moment for you, right? And for you as the person who is being part of that moment, it was nice to just have someone else do it. And also, I think there is a gift associated with creating a moment for someone else, right? It was like a small mitzvah that you could do for someone else.
Yeah.
And now that is gone. There is no longer a need, again, for us to be in relationship with other people, and that the self has become the sole identity by which we define our how we show the world of who we are, right? And we can manipulate that image so that it's not even true to form, right? Even on Zoom, we have the opportunity to do a slider to get rid of any wrinkles we may have, right? So there are all these ways in which the selfie goes against one of the core principles of the Ten Commandments, which is you shall not have idols, and idol worship. And if we are moving more towards the selfie and moving again back to almost idolizing the self, and how much in contrast that is to our tradition, which is all about the orphan, the widow, the stranger, that it's about looking out. It's about understanding the other and not focusing as much on ourselves as the subject matter, but looking on how we can improve the world around us by exploring the other. Think about Martin Buber and his whole concept of I, it versus I, thou, that most of the time we walk through the world and it's us, and when we objectify the world around us, we objectify people, we objectify objects, and that the whole purpose is to get into a relationship where it's an I, thou, where there's something on a deeper level that spiritually connects us to another person. Well, you can't do that if you're just purely trying to spiritually connect with yourself. And the selfie and the selfie culture and putting ourselves at the center is a real challenge. I mean, I was on a call from one of my daughter's schools recently where they were talking about even the challenge for our teens who every single day now are confronted with looking at their faces on Zoom. Right? And how problematic that is when you are in a school setting. You're not looking at your face all the time, right? You're looking at other people, and you are engaging, and of course you are being perceived by others, but you are not having to think about how you look in addition to trying to build social connections with other people, right? Of course you have your insecurities, but you're not reminded of those, and it's not literally in your face when you're in class or when you're at school. And now all of our children are confronted with this, right? And the challenge of how to keep your camera on or to turn it off, and that there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot that I think long term we're going to see potential repercussions of even kind of the Zoom culture, which takes, I think, the selfie idea and now has it go beyond social media into every type of interaction where we are confronted with our face all the time. And so how to fight that, I think our tradition has always been you can't focus so much on the self and idolize that. You have to be looking outward. And I think that's another one of these challenges, in addition to the fake news and how we have to work even harder to find truth. I think then again, as we take it now to this other subject of the selfie, how much harder we have to work to focus our energy outwardly and not so much focus on the self. Any thoughts or reflections on selfie? Yes, Melanie.
Okay, I'm a teacher assistant in Beverly Hills School District, and exactly what the rabbi's talking about, it happens every day. We work with 4th and 5th graders, and they can all see each other's pictures. They can put funny things on their head, then put funny background. They can write all over. You could be doing a math lesson, and they can write all over it, and then we try not to, but the only way to do that is to mute them or put them in a Zoom room by themselves, so yeah, it's exactly what Rabbi Nickerson's saying. It's out of proportion. But when we go back to school, it'll be different in the classroom. But right now it's all ego, trying to make each one look beautiful or funny, and it's taking away from the learning. It is. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah, Merle. And then Penina.
So isn't this whole selfie thing a lot of what TikTok is about? I mean, TikTok is now injecting really nasty stuff and political stuff from all over the world, and who knows who owns what anymore. But isn't all these kids that are taking pictures of themselves dancing or whatever on TikTok, and then they post it on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, or the TikTok site itself, isn't that the same thing with the selfie thing? You're
Yeah, you're right.
Absolutely.
And on top of that, right, we have the likes. So built in is this this mechanism by which you are rewarded for you are either rewarded or not rewarded depending on what you do. And so you have to experiment with yourself on how to best portray yourself to the outside world, right? And then the reward mechanism that comes with that is also, of course, dangerous and problematic.
Today? I posted something. How many likes did I get?
Exactly. Panina?
Posting it.
Years ago, when I started teaching, I was told that it takes a child, or 7 times to hear a word, to remember it. Okay. Then 20 years later or 30 years later, when I asked or the discussion came back, I was told that it takes 15 times to listen to the same thing in order for a child to remember, because of all this stuff that's coming in through the computer, all this information, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, but a lot to absorb. So the more things you have to absorb, the more time it takes you to remember that one thing. So I was thinking to myself, what will kind of an environment will be that the child will be able to hear the most from to remember. So the only thing that I can think of is home and school. Okay. So there's got to be some kind of interaction, which today I think a lot of schools do, between the parents and the child, in order to come to some kind of a ideal situation where the child will be able to be exposed to the what we think is the right thing the most, and then remember it and live according to whatever it is that we as parents will be able to explain to them or teach them or provide even the sources. And the best thing is actually from experience. Your life, the way you grew up, the way you were brought up, what you learned in your life and what he's learning now, at some point has to connect. It has to be a continuation of what was before he came to this world, and then from then on, what it is that happened and how it completes people or adds to one's life. So I'm not teaching anymore, and I'm still debating of what will be the right approach from the schools and the parents that will be kind of like helping each other to accomplish these things that you want one to accomplish, to be a productive member of society and a happy person of society. Full of pride in self-identification, full of confidence of his thoughts. Pride, I think, is a very important thing. So I think I know that we're talking here about what happened to the Jewish people. I think we have to learn to be proud of what we are, and especially of the land of Israel and what it does now, and their position in the world, how much they contribute, how much they are accomplishing, how much all the other countries really need them because of what they accomplish.
Good, thank you.
So it has to be done. We're talking about Jewish identity. I know that it pulled in other identities.
It's all right. I think it's all related. And Miriam, in a minute, I'll turn to you. But I think also it's what you're also pointing out is one of the challenges of selfie culture is this idea of being in the moment. And what you're talking about with education, especially Jewish education, is putting ourselves in a historical context, right? And that part of education is understanding where you came from and where you're going. And a selfie culture is purely about this moment in the immediate. It's not about connecting yourself to other moments. And that's another challenge to our Jewish value system. If we're only in this moment and we're not putting ourselves in a context, that is yet another challenge that we have to be aware of. If we want to kind of go into a social media understanding from a Jewish perspective and we want to hold on to our Jewish values, then we have to understand that level as well. Miriam.
Dana, I enjoyed what you said very much. And I connected to a particular word that you used, which was the word connect. I myself taught a bit. I taught 53 years of my life, and I taught teachers mostly. And so that the word engage is probably the most important word we can use today in our teaching. Otherwise, we would all be so brilliant. We who studied so much and studied more for our masters, etc., after college, what do we remember? We remember that which was important for us to remember. Everything else, all those facts, thank God, we'll look them up. I would use the word, we'll look them up in the encyclopedia, but that belongs to yesteryear, and the children today do not know what an encyclopedia is. So what we have to get across in our children, whether we're teaching preschool or whether we're teaching adults that are teaching, which I did for those 53 years, I taught teachers. Now, what do we have to learn? And I'm going to end with something very simple. We have to stop asking fact questions so the kid with the best memory gets to be called on and he's rewarded. We have to stop teaching that way. Hopefully we'll
Great.
always have facts, and hopefully we'll have our Bible for many, many millennia. We
Yes.
start our questions with, I want to hear what you think. We start questions no matter what the age. If we have to ask questions, little ones we don't. We just engage them with love and surround them with a tremendous loving atmosphere, and that's how they learn. But we have to engage each child as though every kid in the class, no matter what the age, is very important. And how they felt, how do you feel about that? What do you think about that is what we have to start doing as teachers, and stop asking more and more fact questions. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Miriam. All right, I want us to since we're only down to 15 minutes, and we want to cover at least a couple more topics very, very quickly. Jeff brought up in the very beginning this idea of the bullying and also called trolling, where there are people who now anonymously, unlike in the good old days where if you had something to say to someone, you had to actually either say it to their face or find a way to even. You couldn't really get away as anonymously as you can today, right? And now today, people have the opportunity to go online and publicly shame other people, even to do so anonymously, and to say things that they would never say to someone's face, right? But that through this protective layer of the internet, their devilish side is able to come out, and they can start to bring all of their angst and anger out into the world in such a terrible way. It made us think about the passage from Baba Metzia from the Talmud, where Rabbi Nachman of Yitzhak says, one who embarrasses another in public, it's as if he is committing murder, right? And the whole idea is that if the face of the person who is embarrassed, if their face is turning red, it's as if their blood is being spilled, right? So in our tradition, the idea of not embarrassing someone has always been really important. It's one of the central values, that you're not supposed to embarrass someone in public, and that you're supposed to do it in a way respectfully behind closed doors, but that public shaming is not the way to accomplish anything. It's not productive at all. It's not the way in which our rabbis and our tradition has understood the way in which you debate in a healthy manner, because of course you can disagree with people, but the way in which you have that debate, as we know about Hillel and Shammai and the way they've debated each other, that it's not one in which you publicly shame someone. And so we don't have to go through too in depth, but this idea of trolling, this idea of cyberbullying, as Jeff pointed out, the fact that people's lives have been lost or they've taken their own lives as the result of this kind of thing, and the amount of B'nai Mitzvah Divrei Torah that I work with students on, and I'm sure Cantor Lisa can attest to this as well, the number of kids who are 13 who are talking about cyberbullying and online bullying in their speeches at their bar bat mitzvahs, to me is a sign, number one, a good, on the positive side, a great thing that they're aware of it and something that they know needs to be addressed. On the other side, just like laws are created because there's a challenge in the society that needs to be addressed, if there are this many 13-year-olds who are talking about cyberbullying, or the fact that I had one kid a few weeks ago who talked about how when he was, someone had posted on Instagram after seeing someone, I smell autism. Right. And these kinds of references, these deep terrible references that people are cutting into each other. And he talked about how reprehensible this is. But these are 13-year-olds who are already dealing with this, right? Wow. So the challenge that we face as a society, but also the responsibility we have as a Jewish community to teach the right way to debate, the importance of respecting other people, even if you disagree with them, right? That there is almost a sense of destruction and murder when you embarrass someone, and for us all to be aware of that and to really stand up, just as though we stand up to people in the streets when we disagree, when they're doing something reprehensible. We have that responsibility online as well, and to make a stand on that. So that's another challenge that we face. You know, obviously, we started with some of the positives of social media, but clearly all of those positives require us to do so much work on all these different areas that we're discussing now in order to make sure that we can set up a healthy future for ourselves, but definitely for the next generation. Cantor Lisa, wanted to turn it to your last piece before we run out of time. Oh, can't hear you.
You're muted.
That was weird.
Oh, now we hear you.
Now? Okay.
Oh, but now you're echoing.
Good now?
Better.
Okay. It disconnected from my AirPods. So like when it does that, the computer has to catch up. So the last one I want to talk about, which really has a lot to do with social media, and I think teaching future generations, is this idea of reality and public persona and what Judaism has to say about the importance of privacy and the kinds of things that you do keep private, because there is like a holiness to keeping things to yourself, things about your family, personal issues. And so there's a portion in the Torah, Parshat Balak, where as the Israelites have now come into the land that was promised to them, they of course realize that it's filled with inhabitants, and they have the unfortunate job of having all of these different battles that are very successful. And the king of Moab, Balak, fears this encroaching Israelite camp and goes and hires a magician, a seeker, Balaam, to put a curse upon the Israelites. Long story short, Balaam goes to curse the Israelites, and upon seeing their camp, instead what comes out is a blessing. And this is one of the blessings that we say when we start services that you learn in day school or in religious school. Matovu ohalecha Yaakov. Yes. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Kind of a strange blessing. So the rabbis, of course, ask, what was it that made Balaam have to say this blessing about tents? And the most famous answer is given in the Talmud, Rosh Hashanah 60a, which teaches that Balaam observed that the way that the Israelites arranged their homes, it was in a way in which no one's window or door faced the door or window of another home. No one had to fear that their neighbors were observing them while they were conducting their private affairs in their home. And this rabbinic legend, our rabbis and sages are trying to tell us about the importance of privacy, that there are things that are for the public and there are things that are meant to be private. So in an offline world, most social communities tend to follow and practice those norms. You don't have to share your birthday if you don't want to, or your marital status when you meet someone in person, or your likes and dislikes. They don't need to know what your breakfast looked like. But when you're online, in the world of social networking, you're supposed to disclose all of this personal information in order to be accepted by the online community. Once you become an active member on the site delves into who you are. It delves into what your likes are. I mean, I'm still constantly horrified that I can look up something on Amazon that I want to buy, and for the next week, I'm inundated by advertisements. And so many of us put so much information on Facebook, especially the younger generations, when we talk about TikTok, filming these videos in their kitchen, in their bedrooms. We're putting all of this information out there. And it's being, collected. There's kind of this lack of privacy, but what that story in the Torah shows is that privacy, sometimes the word for privacy can be conflated with modesty, the idea of tzniut, that it's been a concern for thousands of years. And like most likely, our sages would be kind of horrified at the lack of privacy that we see in the world of social media, and especially I think it's American society and wanting to show what you have and then see what others have, which also goes against our 10 commandments of not wanting to covet things that aren't ours. So my question is, in this world of social media, how can we balance our traditions, desire and request for that holiness, for that privacy, and not throw away things that perhaps weren't meant for the public to see? Any thoughts on that?
I wanted to get rid of Facebook, and I went to the Apple store and I told them I don't want it. And Talia put it on my thing like a long time ago. Well, supposedly they were supposed to take it off, and they took it off. I still get notifications about things that has to do, my husband's picture, may he rest in peace, when he's in Hawaii, that was taken like 3 years ago, all of a sudden shows up. And my birthday, today's your birthday, and I don't want people to know my birthday, because my birthday sometimes is a password to maybe other things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what is this? And it's still there, and I'm still getting the notifications. Explain this to me. I gave up.
The challenge of getting off of social media, I think that's what you're raising. I can't help you. Maybe Talia can help you with the IT behind the scenes of actually purging it from you.
If you reverse the question, Rabbi, I think it's a very important question as to why. I may be the only guy in this whole group that's never had a social media presence. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. But the bottom line is, the question becomes, why did people sign on to begin with? What does that say about them? Think about the time that they could use within their own family to share, to augment, to educate, to do, that they spend on social media. And the question is, what are they gaining? What prurient interest, what voyeuristic qualities does that represent in people? And
there's that side of it, Jeff, I totally agree with you. I also think that there's also this balance between, another big part of Judaism, which is the need for community, the need to feel a part of something. That for a lot of these online communities, especially for the younger generations, they feel like they are part of a community. The TikTokers who are making the video and their followers, like that is their community. So there's this balance between wanting to feel connected, but that connectedness having some very big dangers to our mental health, to the status of our world. And it's finding a balance between this need, this want for community, which I think is just, it's human nature to want to feel a part of something. It's why we all belong to a temple.
But look at the cultism that goes into that.
Yeah.
The idea of the recruitment by the Islamics to dangerous organizations, this lack within yourself, this need. Why aren't you able to discuss this within your group, within your family, within, people just aren't able, it seems, to purify themselves in a way that gives them any sense of peace. They find routes to more unraveling than they find in putting themselves back together as people of kindness and worth.
So can I just add?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just really quickly with regard to what Jeff said at the beginning, I think the problem is I think there are pros. I have never had social media, Facebook either, but I have Twitter and I have other things, but Facebook. But the problem is when these relationships take over the depth of real in-person relationships. I think, which
Exactly.
you touched on it a little bit at the beginning. I think the breadth and the depth of relationships are different, and there's a space for everything, and the depth of a personal relationship should never be taken over by a technology relationship. I'm sure that all of this group, because of being here, I highly recommend the movie Social Dilemma, which is fantastic and talks about how everything is manipulated to what gets popped at you. So I think just wanted to add that at the very end.
I think there's another piece to this. I mean, I was bullied as a child. I was bullied a few years ago as an adult. My daughter was bullied like in the 3rd or 4th grade, and the whole 4th grade class was bullied. A lot of that is what comes then and now, and before there was no social media. I think that a lot of it comes out of people's homes and what those kids' parents or spouses or partners or whatever, what their belief is being taught to their relations and their community, or what community they're involved in. I think the most important things for us as adults, whether we're parents, grandparents, husbands, wives, whatever, is that we have to teach. And it goes back to just teaching what's right and wrong, and what you can do that's safe for yourself. I mean, my grandchildren are limited. They aren't on Facebook. You know, they're on Instagram because of dance and karate. But they're not allowed. Everything that they post gets previewed before they post it. And it sounds like it's rigid, but my daughter and son-in-law are teaching them what's right and wrong, and what part of a community how you're part of a community, and the right way to respond to people, or how to react to people when, in the case of bullying, when you're bullied. And I think that's a responsibility we all have. Social media is there. It's not getting knocked down. Twitter, everything. It's all social media in one way or another. But I think our responsibility as adults, no matter what age we are, is to teach what is right and wrong, and what we shouldn't be doing, and how we should or shouldn't react to what we see or hear.
To extend Merle's reference, parents have the obligation, yes, to teach. And in my generation, we allowed TV and Sesame Street to help us teach ethics and morality. Today, parents are allowing indiscriminate use of social media and internet technology to become the teacher of their children. Whether voluntarily or covertly, these children are not getting the input from their parents, families, grandparents, etc., because they're locked into these devices like children were to Sesame Street and other socially more acceptable modes of teaching. Scary.
To wrap up, we talked about, earlier when we started, that with great power, which is what this social media has, this new world that we live in, comes a great responsibility. And the same way that we look to the Torah for examples of moral or unmoral or ethical or non-ethical behavior of our biblical ancestors, that social media has kind of highlighted the good and the bad about human nature. And the same way that we have to be cautious and teach how to use these things responsibly, how to monitor their usage, that we have to treat this world of social media the same way that we treat our children to behave in the streets. It's no longer just how you behave in your home and how you behave on the streets. It's now extended to how you behave virtually as a moral and ethical person, and how, as Jews, we have the added responsibility of still being that light unto the nations, of spreading that goodness and that morality even in our virtual interactions. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. This was really nice.
And very
Nice to see you both.
Nice to see you guys too.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Beth, you want to stay a moment?
Sure.
Okay. I just want to say to you and to Yeah, the gal